Young black man humiliated by police, but when they discover his father's true identity, they're left completely surprised. Ethan was walking through the streets of Kensington, the morning sun filtering through the trees, creating a soft pattern of light and shadow on the ground. He carried a heavy backpack filled with books on civil rights and law history, dreaming of becoming a human rights attorney. The smell of fresh coffee from a local cafe made him pause for a moment, but the urgency to get to college pushed him to move on. Little did he know that this day would become a turning point in his life. As he turned a corner, Ethan noticed a police car parked on the sidewalk. A strange feeling settled in his stomach, but he tried to ignore it. Soon enough, he felt the presence of two police officers behind him. One of them, a burly sergeant with a stern expression, called out to him, "Hey, you, stop right there." Ethan turned around, his heart racing. "Yes, sir. What's going on? You're wondering why we're here, aren't you?" The sergeant stepped closer, his tone dismissive. "You know this area is known for trouble. Let's take a look at your backpack." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong. This isn't about doing something wrong. We're just doing our job. Put the backpack on the ground and open it," the sergeant ordered, while his partner, a young officer, watched with an approving look. Reluctantly, Ethan obeyed, placing the backpack on the ground. He felt the curious stares of passers-by, the embarrassment swelling in his chest. "This is completely unnecessary," he murmured, trying to stay calm. The sergeant began to rummage through the backpack, pulling out books one by one. "Civil rights, huh? What do you plan to do with that? Fight against the police?" He laughed, a hostile sound. "You think you're going to change anything?" "That's not what I'm trying to do," Ethan replied, his voice trembling with indignation. "I just want to study and become a lawyer." "A lawyer for whom? For criminals like you?" The sergeant shot back, and humiliation filled Ethan like a balloon about to burst. "I'm not a criminal," Ethan exclaimed, frustration spilling over. "I'm just trying to get to college." "Shut up," the sergeant interrupted, shoving one of the books back into the backpack roughly. "You have no idea what it's like to be respected in this city. Go back to where you belong." The words cut like a knife. The officer, who had been silent, started to laugh. "You must have been educated in an elite school, but here it doesn't matter. You're just another black person in the wrong place." Ethan felt his eyes burning, but he forced himself not to cry. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him weak. "Come on, this is racism," he murmured, but the sergeant merely looked at him with contempt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers let him go, but not without making sarcastic comments about how he should be grateful he wasn't arrested. Ethan picked up his backpack, now a symbol of the disdain he had just endured, and hurried away. When he got home, the anguish still clung to him. He found his mother, Margaret, in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The aroma of spices comforted him, but the feeling of humiliation lingered. "Hey son, how was your day?" she asked, unaware of the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "It was hard," Ethan replied, hesitating. He didn't want to worry his mother, but the pain of the experience was hard to hide. "Hard how?" Margaret insisted, sensing something was wrong. Ethan hesitated, the words forming and dissolving in his mind. "I was stopped by the police. They searched me and said horrible things," he finally revealed, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret paused, her expression hardening. "Oh, Ethan, that's unacceptable. You need to talk about this." "I don't know. I feel so powerless, Mum." "Like there's nothing I can do," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "We need to fight against this. You can't let them hurt you," she responded firmly. "You are much stronger than you think." But at that moment, Ethan just wanted to lie down and forget. He went to his room, his mind racing, and as he lay down, he replayed every word the police had said. Humiliation, anger, and helplessness swirled inside him. He couldn't let this slide. Determined to seek justice, he began researching civil rights and cases of police brutality. The idea of becoming a defender of truth starting to take shape in his mind. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, the soft afternoon light filtering through the curtains when his mother, Margaret, entered. He had barely touched his food, his restless hands fiddling with the fork. The silence between them was thick, laden with unspoken emotions. Sensing the tension in the air, Margaret decided to break the silence. "Ethan, are you okay? You seem so distant today," she said, observing the worried look on her son's face. He hesitated, his words poised on the tip of his tongue, but the pain and humiliation choked his voice. Finally, he decided to open up. "Mom, today I was stopped by the police. They interrogated me on the street and it was humiliating. They treated me like I was a criminal," he confessed, frustration spilling out in his voice. Margaret stopped, her look of concern deepening. "Oh, my son, that's terrible. Do you want me to do something? I can talk to your father." The mention of his father made Ethan's chest tighten. "No, I don't want to talk to him. He probably wouldn't care. He's too busy with work and his reputation. He's never been there for me, Mom. I don't know anything about him. And now I find out he's a respected judge. How can I trust him?" Margaret sighed, the pain evident on her face as she absorbed Ethan's words. "Richard has always worked hard. He believes he's doing what's best for us, but I understand your frustration. It's hard for him too." "Hard? For him? He's not the one being humiliated because of the color of his skin," Ethan fired back, his voice rising as anger began to take over him. "He doesn't know what it's like to walk in fear, knowing that the police can stop you at any moment. He doesn't know what it's like to be treated like you're not even human." Margaret moved closer, placing her hand on her son's shoulder. "Ethan, you need to understand that he's fighting his own battles. The system is complicated, and it's trying to do what it can. But that doesn't diminish what you've been through. You need to express yourself, fight for your truth." "Express? Fight? How do I do that, Mom? What can I do? I'm just a law student. No one is going to listen to a kid like me," he replied, the despondency evident in his voice. Margaret looked into Ethan's eyes, her own eyes filled with tears. "You have a voice, Ethan, and you can use it. Don't give up. I know you can make a difference." After that conversation, Ethan felt torn. The revelation about his father and the world around him left him confused. He needed to confront Richard. He needed to understand why his father had never been present in his life. However, the idea of opening up to a man he barely knew terrified him. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan found himself lost in thought. He couldn't let go of the humiliation and pain. Injustice needed to be fought, and he was determined to do something about it. With a new sense of purpose, he began researching civil rights, cases of police brutality, and social movements. Ethan's eyes lit up as he delved into stories of people who had fought against the system, fueling his determination. He wasn't alone in this struggle, and he wouldn't just be a victim. The next morning, he decided it was time to confront Richard. He was tired of feeling powerless and wanted an honest dialogue, a chance to understand the man who was his father and how his choices impacted both their lives. "Dad, we need to talk," Ethan said as he entered Richard's office, where the judge was buried in papers and law books. The judge looked up, surprised by the interruption. "Ethan, now isn't a good time." "I'm very busy with an upcoming case," Richard replied, diverting his gaze. "That's exactly what I want to discuss. It's always about work for you, isn't it? What about me? What about what happened to me yesterday? You don't care." Ethan felt his anger and frustration spilling over. "I care, but you need to understand the weight of my responsibilities." "It's not that simple," Richard said, trying to keep his calm. "Not simple? You don't know what it's like to be treated like a criminal just for being on the street. I need you to listen to me, Dad." Ethan's voice trembled with the intensity of his emotion. "Ethan, I'm trying to do the best I can," Richard replied, his voice softer, but the tension still hung in the air. "But what is the best if you don't care about what happens outside these walls? You're a judge, and I'm your son. I can't understand how you can remain indifferent to this." Ethan was about to explode, his heart racing, waiting for a response that never seemed to come. Richard's expression turned into a mix of concern and frustration. "I need you to comprehend the complexity of the system. It's not as black and white as you imagine." But for Ethan, everything seemed very straightforward. He wanted justice, and his father's inaction only fueled his outrage. "Complexity or not, I can't stand by while injustices happen. I can't and I won't." The tension between them was palpable, and the emotional distance felt insurmountable. The conversation didn't bring the answers Ethan hoped for, but it ignited a fire within him. He was determined to fight not just for himself, but for all those who faced the same kind of oppression. And even if it meant challenging his own father, he was more than willing to face that battle. Ethan sat at the cafeteria table at his college, staring at his coffee as it slowly cooled. The conversation with his mother still echoed in his mind, but now he felt more lost than ever. The humiliation he suffered at the hands of the police left him angry and confused, a mix of rage and sadness that lingered. He thought about how powerless he felt, as if his words and his pain meant nothing. When Jamie approached, bringing with him a relaxed air that contrasted with the weight Ethan carried, he tried to force a smile. "Hey man, how was class today?" Jamie asked, as he pulled up a chair and sat down across from Ethan. "It was fine, but I can't stop thinking about what happened yesterday," Ethan replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "That encounter was humiliating. They treated me like a criminal just for being on the street." Jamie frowned, concern etched on his face as he looked at his friend. "You need to let that go, man. That kind of stuff happens all the time. It's not worth stressing over some idiots." "Not worth it?" Ethan exclaimed, his voice rising an octave. "You don't get it. It's not just an encounter, it's a matter of dignity. It's a bigger issue, Jamie. It's what happens to people like me every single day." "But Ethan, do you think you can change anything? The system is broken and you know that. Trying to fight it is like battling windmills," Jamie replied, shaking his head, a skeptical look on his face. "I can't just stand by and accept this. If I don't do anything, who will?" Ethan said, his determination growing. "I want to fight for my rights and for the rights of everyone who has suffered like I have. Look, I get that you want to do something, but the system doesn't want to listen. What are you going to do? Talk to the police? They don't care," Jamie said, crossing his arms, a skeptical expression on his face. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "You might not believe it, but I will do something. I'm not alone in this. There are others who feel the same way." "Do you really think you can change anything?" Jamie asked, his voice betraying a hint of doubt he couldn't hide. "I have to try, Jamie. I can't turn a blind eye. I can't stay silent," Ethan asserted, his passion for justice burning like a flame within him. After that conversation, an idea began to take shape in Ethan's mind. He wasn't alone, and that gave him courage. Contrary to what Jamie said, there was strength in the community that needed to be united, a voice that needed to be heard. He began to plan, envisioning how he could mobilize the people around him. Yet, even so, the loneliness he felt in his struggle was palpable. That night, Ethan and Jamie met again, this time in a park near the college. "Ethan, are you still thinking about doing something?" Jamie asked, his voice hesitant. "Yes, I am. I want to organize a protest, a vigil. We need people to see what's happening. We can't let them ignore us," Ethan replied, his excitement reflected on his face. "A protest? Are you crazy? This could go very wrong," Jamie said, concerned. "Things could heat up and you have no idea what the police might do. I know the risks, but we need to do something. If we don't act now, what will change? People need to understand that we are not alone, that our voices matter," Ethan insisted. Jamie looked at his friend. The determination in his eyes touched him. "All right, I'm in. But we need to be careful and we need more people." And so their idea began to take shape. They started talking to other friends, sharing the vision of an event that would unite the community in a collective cry for justice and equality. Ethan felt that slowly, the darkness surrounding him was beginning to dissipate. With the support of Jamie and other friends, he felt stronger and more determined than ever to fight against the injustices surrounding them. Ethan and Jamie were determined to make their voices heard. The idea of organizing a vigil in Kensington began to take shape in their minds. They sat down at a local cafe, surrounded by coffee mugs and an air of expectation. The cafe's walls were adorned with local art, but nothing seemed as vibrant as the energy emanating from Ethan as he spoke about his ideas. "We need to bring the community together, Jamie," Ethan said, the spark in his eyes reflecting the passion that consumed him. "If we can do this, we can show that we are not alone, that people are willing to fight for justice." Jamie looked at him, the expression of skepticism still present on his face. "And you think this will change anything? The police won't care about a handful of people holding candles." "It's not just that, man," Ethan replied, his voice rising in intensity. "It's about raising awareness, showing that we are here, that we will no longer accept this. Every person who joins us is one more step against this oppressive system." Jamie sighed, feeling the weight of reality. "Okay, then let's do it. But we need to ensure that people understand why we're doing this. We can't let it just become another event that nobody takes seriously." In the days that followed, Ethan and Jamie worked tirelessly to plan the vigil. They made posters, sent messages on social media, and talked to friends and acquaintances. The idea that the community could come together to confront police brutality seemed to be gaining momentum. On the eve of the vigil, a wave of anxiety washed over Ethan. He was at home, sitting at the kitchen table, while his mother, Margaret, prepared dinner. The smell of homemade food filled the air, but Ethan's worries overshadowed any comfort that meal could bring. "Are you okay, dear?" Margaret asked, noticing the somber expression on her son's face. "You seem worried." "I just want this to work, Mom. If we can't mobilize people, all this will be for nothing," Ethan replied, his thoughts tangled in uncertainties. "Ethan, you've already done so much. Remember that change takes time. Don't give up now," Margaret encouraged, placing her hand on his shoulder. "People need someone like you to lead. You are making a difference." On the night of the vigil, Kensington was lit by candles. The town square, usually bustling and full of life, was now filled with familiar and unfamiliar faces, all united in a single purpose. Ethan felt his heart race as he watched the crowd gather, each person bringing their own stories of pain and resistance. "Look at this, Ethan," Jamie exclaimed, pointing to the number of people arriving. "I didn't expect so many to show up." "Me neither. This is incredible," Ethan replied, his nervousness giving way to determination. He climbed onto a small makeshift stage and took the microphone, the crowd silencing as he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Ethan started, his voice steady. "We gather not just for me, but for everyone who has suffered at the hands of police brutality. This is a moment for us to unite and raise our voices against injustice." Applause echoed through the square, and Ethan felt the energy of the crowd. He saw familiar and unfamiliar faces, all sharing a common feeling. No one should go through what I went through. No one should feel the fear that this community feels every day, but we are here to change that. As he spoke, Ethan realized the importance of that night. It wasn't just a vigil, it was a call to action. Tears and smiles mixed, forming a human tapestry of hope and determination. After the speech, as people began to disperse, Ethan felt stronger than ever. He and Jamie talked with the attendees, collecting stories and forming bonds. But even though the vigil had been a success, a shadow of concern lingered over Ethan. He began receiving anonymous threats on social media, messages that left him alert and worried about his family's safety. "Do you think we should be worried about this?" Jamie asked, noticing the worried expression on his friend's face. "Yes, I think so," Ethan replied, looking around as if expecting someone to appear. "I can't let this stop me. We have to keep fighting, but we also need to protect our families." Ethan's determination was unshakable, but the reality of the danger he faced complicated everything. The vigil had been a significant step, but the fight was far from over. The courtroom was immersed in a tense silence as Ethan entered through the door, his heart racing. He sat down in the section reserved for plaintiffs, his gaze fixed on his father, Sir Richard Carter, who occupied the judge's seat. To many, Richard was a respected man, a pillar of justice. But for Ethan in that moment, he symbolized a system that seemed to have failed him. Nervousness grew as tensions mounted, and the reality of the trial became increasingly palpable. Ethan looked at his father's face, which was calm, but he could sense the pressure weighing on Richard's shoulders. His father's eyes, usually so firm, were now slightly clouded, as if he were internally battling the decision he would have to make. The room was filled with journalists, activists, and community members, all attentive to the outcome of this emblematic case. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to contain the anxiety threatening to overwhelm him. "Mr. Carter," the prosecutor said, "enter. We are ready to hear the testimonies of the victims." The first witness is Mrs. Thompson. A middle-aged woman stood up with a determined look, and Ethan felt a mix of hope and despair upon hearing the prosecutor's words. He knew that each testimony represented not only his case, but the pain of many others. Mrs. Thompson began to speak, her voice trembling but firm. "I was on the corner when I saw my son being approached by police. They shoved him against the wall and searched him for no reason. He was just coming home from school." The memories made her hesitate, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "My son did nothing wrong. He was only 14. Ethan felt a wave of empathy wash over him. He remembered when his own childhood was interrupted by police brutality. The pain of that mother was the pain of many, and he was determined to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had suffered. After Mrs. Thompson's testimony, other accounts followed. Each story seemed more painful than the last, and Ethan felt increasingly empowered. He stood when it was his turn to speak, a mix of determination and vulnerability in his eyes. He positioned himself at the center of the courtroom, the room now completely silent, except for the sound of his breath. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice steady but slightly trembling. "Today, I am not here merely as a victim, but as a representative of all those who have felt powerless in the face of injustice. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It reflects a systemic problem that affects the lives of so many, especially in the black community. Ethan paused, observing the reactions around him. Richard looked at him, his eyes showing a mix of pride and anguish. When I was stopped, it was not just my dignity that was at stake, but the dignity of all of us. I was treated like a criminal, and that should not happen to anyone. Aggressive policing is not just a matter of police techniques, it is a matter of conscience, of empathy. Justice must prevail. The room was filled with murmurs of approval, and Ethan heard them clearly. He could feel the energy rising, as if his words were touching something deep in the heart of everyone present. He knew his father was there, but at that moment, he was more concerned with the message he needed to convey than with the relationship between them. After his speech, when Ethan returned to his seat, a heavy silence settled in. Richard looked at his son, his heart torn. He knew the pressure was immense. "Ethan," Richard whispered when the court was interrupted, "you did an excellent job. I'm proud, but we need to be careful about what comes next." "You can be just, Dad. I just hope you choose to do what's right," Ethan replied, his voice laden with emotion. He saw the internal struggle on Richard's face, and for a brief moment wished things were different between them. The relationship they should have was overshadowed by social pressure and the fight for justice. As the trial continued, the tension escalated. Ethan knew that the fight had only just begun, and the truth being revealed could change everything. Above all, he hoped that his father, as the judge, would make the right decision. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and the eyes of the public were fixed on the accused officers. The atmosphere was thick, loaded with emotions and expectations. At the center of this storm were Sergeant Williams, a police veteran, and Officer Cooper, a young, ambitious man beginning to feel suffocated by the consequences of their actions. Williams sat with his head down, his hands clasped in his lap. He had always believed that the police were a force for good, but now he found himself cornered between the pressures of the system he had always defended and the brutal reality that young people like Ethan were facing. "What happened to you, Williams?" he thought, recalling his early days as a police officer when he felt proud of the uniform he wore. "When did I stop being a protector of the law and become an oppressor?" On the other side, Cooper looked around nervously. He was younger, still feeling the adrenaline of youth coursing through his veins, but the ambition that had driven him into this career was now becoming a burden. "I just wanted to do my job," he murmured to himself, increasingly unsettled by the evidence emerging. "But at what cost? What do I really stand for here?" The two officers met in a corner of the courtroom, away from the scrutinizing gazes of the public. Williams broke the silence. "Cooper, this situation is worse than I imagined. You know this isn't how it should be, right? I didn't want it to come to this." "I know, Sergeant, but you also know how it works. They don't care about the truth, only about the narrative. And we're the villains in this story," Cooper replied, his voice heavy with frustration. He felt the weight of guilt, but also the pressure from his superiors. "Do you think anyone will care about how we feel? We're just numbers to them." "What if we did something about it?" Williams asked, looking into the young man's eyes. "We need to be honest. We can't let the pressure make us forget who we really are. If we can't stand up for ourselves, who will?" Cooper hesitated, his mind wrestling between loyalty to what he had always known and the new reality unfolding before him. "But what if we fail? What if our defense isn't enough? I can't lose my job, my career. That would mean the end for me," he said, his voice trembling. "Sometimes you have to risk everything to do what's right," Williams asserted, his voice resolute. "Do you remember what they taught us in the academy? Protect and serve? It's not just a catchphrase. We must be the change we want to see." Meanwhile, the trial continued, and the voices of the courtroom echoed in their thoughts. Williams and Cooper returned to their place, and in front of them, the defense of the officers tried to discredit the witnesses. The pressure mounted, and the gaze of the jurors was relentless. Williams felt a chill run down his spine when he saw the defense attorney, a cunning man ready to attack. "If we don't take a stand now, we'll be remembered as the monsters in this story," Williams whispered to Cooper as the defense questioned Ethan's credibility. "What if the truth isn't enough? What if they don't care?" Cooper retorted, anguished. The words of his partner haunted him, but he couldn't shake off the doubt. "We need to have faith. The truth, no matter how difficult, will always find a way. And the community needs to know that not all police officers are the villains they think we are," Williams insisted, although uncertainty settled in his heart. The court was about to make a decision that could change everything. Williams realized that more than a trial, This was a reflection on the very nature of justice and what it means to be a police officer. He looked at Cooper, who was conflicted, and understood that they were both fighting not just for their careers but for their souls. "We'll face this together, no matter what happens," Williams said, determined, as the weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders. The courtroom was in absolute silence, the tension palpable in the air. Ethan, standing at the witness stand, felt the weight of all eyes fixed on him. Judge Richard Carter, his father, was there, imposing in his robe, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. The moment approaching was decisive, not only for the case, but for the relationship between father and son, which was already on the brink of collapse. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. He had prepared for this moment, knowing he needed to speak, not just for his own dignity, but for all the voices that had been silenced. He raised his hand, asking for permission to speak. Richard nodded slowly, his eyes revealing a mix of concern and pride, but also a shadow of sadness. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ethan began, his voice strong and clear, "today I am not here just to recount my experience. I am here to speak about a pattern of oppression that many of us citizens face every day. Police brutality is not an isolated incident. It is a reality that destroys lives and communities." He paused, observing the jury. "On the day I was stopped, I was not just treated as a suspect, I was stripped of my dignity, my humanity. The way the police treated me was not merely a matter of abuse of power, but a manifestation of the institutional racism that permeates our institutions. They saw me as a criminal before they even knew me. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is unacceptable." Ethan's words echoed in the room, and he could see some people in the audience shifting, visibly moved. He continued, increasingly fueled by the fervor of his message. "I know that many of you have also felt fear when seeing a police car approach. I am not just a number in a police report. I am a son, a brother, a friend, and today I cry out for justice, not only for myself, but for all those who have been silenced." Ethan's voice trembled, but he remained steady, looking into Richard's eyes, seeking a connection, a sign of understanding. "Dad, I know you are here as a judge, but I am also your son. What you decide could change not just my future, but the future of many. You have the power to make a difference." The silence in the room was profound, almost deafening. Richard felt torn. The intensity of Ethan's emotion hit him like a punch to the gut. He was witnessing his son transform into an advocate, someone fighting against everything he, Richard, had always wanted to protect. But at the same time, the pressure of his position as a judge consumed him. "You can't ignore what's happening, Dad," Ethan continued, his voice now a mixture of pleading and determination. "I see the fear in the eyes of people in our community. They no longer trust you, and how can you blame them? You know what they face every day, and I can't be just another forgotten victim in this system." Richard felt the pressure growing in his chest. He knew the truth was being laid bare before everyone. For a judge, the commitment to justice was sacred, but for a father, the protection of his son would always be a priority. He looked at the jury, then at Ethan, and saw the future his son was trying to build, a future he could not allow to be destroyed. The defense attorney, noticing the rising emotion in the room, tried to shift the focus. "Ethan, do you really believe what happened to you was a matter of racism? Wouldn't it be more appropriate to think it was simply a judgment error on the part of the police?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "No, it's not that simple. If it were, we wouldn't be here. There would be no need to fight. What I experienced was a clear demonstration of deep-seated prejudice, and we all know it. What we need now is a system that listens to us, not one that silences us." The room fell silent again as Ethan's words resonated. Richard, struggling against his own beliefs and the pressure he felt, couldn't take his eyes off his son. He realized that, regardless of the verdict, what was at stake was far greater than he could have imagined. It was a matter of dignity, justice, and above all, humanity. The atmosphere outside the courthouse was electric. The Kensington community, united by outrage and determination to seek justice, had mobilized en masse following Ethan's emotional speech. Colorful signs and banners were raised in protest, with messages like "Justice for Ethan" and "Stop Police Brutality." The sound of drums and united voices echoed, demonstrating that the fight for dignity and equality was far from just a personal battle. It was now a collective movement. Ethan, alongside Jamie, watched the scene with a mix of pride and anxiety. The crowd pulsed with energy, but the pressure of the situation was palpable. He knew he couldn't fail in the mission he had chosen for himself. This was his moment, and he felt responsible not just for himself, but for all those who had suffered at the hands of the police. "Are you ready for this?" Jamie asked, adjusting the flag he held. "I am. I can't let this opportunity slip away." "We have to make some noise," Ethan replied, his voice firm, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Meanwhile, the tension in Kensington mounted over the following days. A shocking video of another incident of police brutality had surfaced, showing a young man being assaulted by officers in another part of the city. Social media was ablaze, and local media quickly picked up the story. The clamor for justice intensified, and the pressure on the police force began to grow. That morning, as the crowd gathered, Ethan was approached by a reporter from the local television station. With a microphone in hand, she asked, "Ethan, how do you feel seeing the community come together around your cause?" He took a deep breath, aware of the weight of his words. "I feel like we're at a turning point. It's not just about me, it's about all of us. We need to make ourselves heard. Enough is enough. Our lives matter." The reporter nodded, impressed. "Do you believe this movement can bring about real change in the system?" "Yes, I believe it can. If we don't fight, nothing will change. Injustice won't resolve itself," he stated, his gaze fixed on the camera, conveying the message with fervor. In the background, the crowd began to chant, uniting their voices in a plea for justice, while Ethan and Jamie exchanged glances, feeling the power of solidarity forming around them. "Look at this, Ethan. We're making a difference," Jamie shouted, her face lit up with excitement. "Yes, but we need to stay focused. The media is watching us, and this could be our chance to expose what's really happening," Ethan replied, his determination renewed. Media coverage began digging deeper into the situation involving the police officers. The past of Sergeant Williams and Officer Cooper started to emerge, revealing a series of previous incidents of abuse and misconduct. Journalists sifted through files, seeking testimonies and evidence that would challenge the integrity of the police, and the narrative of police brutality became increasingly clear. In a meeting with community leaders, Ethan discussed the new information that was surfacing. "We need to use this to our advantage. If the officers have a history, it only strengthens our case," he said, passion evident in his tone. "But we have to be careful. The last thing we want is for this to backfire on us," an older woman cautioned, her voice heavy with wisdom. "We're fighting for justice, and the truth is powerful. We can't be afraid to expose corruption," Ethan insisted, confident that the fight was larger than his insecurities. As the days passed, the community became a beacon of resistance. Meetings multiplied, and voices that had once been silenced began to speak out. Ethan knew the struggle was just beginning, but the strength he felt seeing people unite by his side filled him with hope. The flame of justice burned brighter than ever, and he was determined to see this fight through to the end. The courtroom was in a sepulchral silence, the white walls reflecting the palpable tension in the air. Ethan sat in his seat, his heart racing out of rhythm. His trembling hands rested on his lap, and his mind whirled in a storm of thoughts. He glanced at his father's face, Sir Richard Carter, who remained impassive behind the judge's bench, a respected man, an icon of justice. But in that moment, Ethan felt betrayed by the one who should have been his greatest defender. "The jury has returned to deliberate, and the verdict will be announced shortly," the prosecution attorney said, his voice echoing like a bell in the courtroom. Each word seemed to heighten the collective anticipation filling the room. The tension between Ethan and Richard was almost palpable, an invisible thread connecting them, but also keeping them apart. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to contain his anxiety. He looked at the audience, which included friends, family, and supporters who had rallied around his cause. He recalled the sleepless nights, the organized vigils, the speeches that had ignited hearts. But now everything depended on what those— "If you can't see what's happening, Dad, you're missing everything," Ethan murmured to himself, knowing Richard wouldn't hear him. The judge stared ahead, lost in his own thoughts. Ethan didn't know if his father was thinking about the law, justice, or the consequences a guilty verdict might have on his career. The defense attorney, a burly man with a disdainful expression, rose to speak, interrupting Ethan's thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is crucial to remember that we are dealing with serious accusations against men who have dedicated their lives to protecting this community. Do not be swayed by emotions. What we have here is a case based on perceptions and misunderstandings." Ethan felt his anger rising. He remembered the police officer's words, the brutality he and others had faced. How can he say that? He thought, clenching his fists. How can he dehumanize what happened? Then the defense attorney's voice rose even louder. The police are not perfect, but they deserve respect. A guilty verdict will not only tarnish their reputations, but also send a dangerous message to all who wear the uniform. Richard looked at the attorney, his expression unchanging, but Ethan noticed the tension in his father's muscles. He was fighting an internal battle that Ethan wished to understand. Silence dragged on as everyone awaited the juries. Finally, the lead juror, a middle-aged woman with a determined expression, entered the room. The courtroom fell silent again, all eyes on her. "We, the jury, have reached a verdict," she announced, her voice steady. "Regarding the charge of assault, we find the defendants—" The room seemed suspended in time. Ethan's heart raced. He felt the breath of everyone around him, the collective anticipation held tight. Richard looked at her, a mix of hope and concern in his gaze. Guilty. A muffled cry erupted among Ethan's supporters, but the judge maintained his composure, merely nodding slightly, as if accepting the inevitable. The euphoria of his supporters contrasted sharply with Richard's hardened expression. Ethan stood up, a blend of relief and disbelief flooding over him. But soon the reality of the moment set in. He saw the tension on his father's face, how Richard straightened in his chair, clearly struggling against the pressure upon him. The judge looked at the jury and then, with a deep sigh, turned to the bench. "Before we communicate the sentences, I would like to make a statement," Richard said, his voice firm yet trembling with an emotion he could not hide. Ethan held his breath. He knew that this was proof that the fight for justice was not just his, it was also his father's. It is important to remember that justice is not an absolute concept. It is a process, a continuous learning journey. Therefore, I ask everyone to consider not just the guilt, but also the circumstances that have brought us here. Ethan felt his frustration boiling over as the judge seemed to hesitate. Why isn't he talking about the victims? Why isn't he advocating for the justice that needs to be served? Ethan's heart squeezed as the tension between him and his father became unbearable. He was about to stand and protest, but the room was already in turmoil and the verdict still echoed in his mind. The courtroom was enveloped in a sepulchral silence as Judge Richard Carter delivered the verdict. Ethan, his heart racing, could barely breathe. This was a pivotal moment, a climax he had imagined countless times while preparing to battle against police brutality. The jury stood up, and the tension was palpable. "Guilty," Richard announced, his voice firm, but Ethan noticed a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. The jury was divided, but the decision had finally been made. However, Ethan's joy was short-lived. As the judge left the bench, he felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. Richard approached Ethan with a look that mixed relief and concern. "Ethan, we need to talk," he said, pulling his son into a more private corner of the room. "I can't let you think this is the end of the fight." "Do you think this is enough, Dad?" Ethan replied, his voice rising in indignation. "They've been found guilty, but what if you decide to reduce their sentence? What does that mean for all of us who fight for justice? Are you going to protect those who have mistreated us again?" Richard hesitated, his eyes heavy with guilt. "I'm trying to do what is right. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. If I'm too harsh, I could lose everything, my position, my career. The system isn't easy, Ethan." "So you're going to give in to corruption just like they did?" Ethan shot back, frustration spilling over. "You are a judge, and you should be the voice of justice. If you're not willing to fight for that, then who will?" Richard's gaze hardened. "Ethan, I'm not your enemy. I want you to have a future. We can't let ourselves be driven by revenge." "Revenge?" Ethan scoffed. "This isn't revenge, Dad, it's justice. And if you're not willing to be the judge you should be, then I will be the voice that echoes for all those who don't have one. The world needs to know what you're hiding." With that declaration, Ethan turned and left the courtroom. He was determined to expose the truth. The press conference was scheduled for that afternoon in Kensington's Central Square, and he knew millions of eyes would be on him. The anger and pain he felt transformed into fuel, and he felt it was time to act. At the press conference, surrounded by reporters and supporters, Ethan took the microphone. "Today we have a victory," he began, his voice steady. "The police officers were found guilty of the brutality that I and so many others have faced. But I cannot stand here and celebrate, because the truth is much darker. The judge who was supposed to ensure justice is my father, and he is trying to protect the guilty." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I will not allow corruption to prevail. What happened here is not just a case. It reflects a system that has repeatedly failed. Reporters rushed to ask questions, but Ethan pressed on. We are tired of empty promises. The fight for justice does not end here. We need real, immediate changes, not just verdicts that can be manipulated. The press conference turned into a rallying cry for justice. Ethan's words resonated throughout the community, galvanizing a movement that quickly spread, uniting forces in search of answers. Meanwhile, the tension between father and son escalated at home. Richard watched the press conference feeling torn. He realized he needed to confront his own shortcomings. The next day, he attended a community event alongside Ethan. I am not perfect, and I acknowledge that I have failed as a father and as a judge, he began, addressing the crowd. It's time to listen to the voices that have been silenced. I support my son and all of you in the pursuit of justice. In the end, with the police officers dismissed and additional lawsuits being filed, Ethan's determination intensified. He reconciled with Richard, who, now more aware, decided to become an ally in the fight for justice. I will fight by your side, Ethan, Richard said sincerely. Together we can make a difference. With this new alliance, Ethan received an offer to work at a prestigious law firm, a significant step in his journey as a human rights advocate. I am determined to fight for real changes in the judicial system, he promised, looking into his father's eyes. And now, I am no longer just a law student. I am the voice of a new generation that will not be silenced. We have now reached the end of this moving story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. At this moment, there's a playlist of videos on your screen. If you want to continue watching these touching stories, just click on it and you'll start watching right away. And now, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and leave your like to support our work. Now, a sincere question, do you agree with what happened in the story? We want to know your opinion. Until the next video.